your time. My name is Heather Leahy, and just wanted to welcome you to our session today, which is on carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS. Over the past several months, our team has received a number of inbounds on the topic. There's definitely lots of interest, really as it's gained momentum and kind of relevance. And as we kind of collectively, as a group, attempt to understand what that technology's path forward looks like. Between different groups that we've spoken to, so it could be EMPs who are assessing storage potential, midstream companies who are scoping out CO2 pipeline routes, and investors who might be seeking exposure to low carbon ventures. Really, from all these conversations, kind of what we've learned and kind of what we really strongly believe is that understanding the risks and the catalysts, as well as the trends across the space, very much so are critical in appropriately framing investment opportunities. And that's going to be the focus for the next few slides here. So really understanding what those considerations and opportunities look like. As you can tell kind of by the title, two different pieces to it. So the webinar will be divided into two parts. First, we'll look to understand where we stand today with CCUS, and then we'll look into trends among planned projects, or kind of the trends of tomorrow. As I'm going through, feel free to ask any questions. There should be a question box at the bottom of your screen, so feel free to ask away and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Quick intro here. Again, my name is Heather Leahy. I'm a member of our intelligence team at Enverus. I've been part of the team for about 4 years now. Started off covering the Eagleford, and then call it maybe a year a bit ago. We just saw so much interest and activity in the CCS space that I've flipped over, and now I work with a group of individuals covering the topic. One of those individuals is Evan McDonald. He's also on the line. He's one of the geologists on our team, and he'll be here to answer any questions you might have at the end of the session too. Starting with our first part. So really, where do we stand today? So to kick us off, if we think back, call it 5, 6 years from now, CCUS really for the most part was not on many operator or investors' radars. If we fast forward to today, we've heard, and I'm sure as you have too, many different commitments to develop and invest in the technology from EMPs, from industrial emitters, even from companies like Microsoft, like Shopify. So, what happened? How did we go from, where we were 5 years ago to where we are now? And kind of what's driven that interest that we've seen, especially over the last, call it 2 years. Well, for many folks, the pandemic has been somewhat of a wake-up call and has really renewed the focus on climate and accelerated the shift towards sustainable investing. So about a year ago, the Biden administration committed to a fairly ambitious goal of reducing net GHG emissions between 50 and 52% by 2030. And Canada has also announced its ambition of achieving net zero by 2050. As it relates specifically to CCUS, the IRS released final guidance earlier last year for the 45Q tax credits, which really is among the most supportive incentives in the world for deploying the technology. It's not represented on this figure, but just note that Canada also unveiled its investment tax credit back in April, which it had been speaking about for a while, and that was through the federal government's 2022 budget. And that would cover 50% of the cost of equipment to capture CO2, and then 37.5% for transportation and use storage equipment as well. So given kind of the 5 to 10 year period we see between concept and commissioning, announced projects, they're not expected to really add meaningful capacity gains until we get into the latter part of the decade, as you can see here. So the figure you're looking at right now on your screen, it shows cumulative capture capacity in North America in through the present, as well as announced additions out to 2040. One thing that you will notice if you just focus on that 2025 bar right on the left or the right-hand side, sorry, of your screen, is that the projects are pretty heavily weighted towards petroleum and natural gas systems. So that's there in pink, and also those that are sourcing CO2 from multiple sectors, which are those in purple. And we'll speak to why that is over the next few slides. Just to provide a little bit of context to the numbers that you're seeing here, in 2021, capture capacity, and really worth emphasizing that this is capacity, it's not throughput, but it amounted to 40 million tons per annum, or less than 2% of the CO2 that was emitted by industrial sources in Canada and the US. But that number jumps all the way up to 11.8%, or just shy of 12% by 2040. And this is just based on the projects that have been announced as of the end of 2021. We definitely have had a number of announcements since then, so you'd expect the number to be even higher. There's polling several folks around the office here talked about this 12% figure, and most have said that it actually was higher than they would have thought, right? So ramping annual capture capacity from 40 to 320 million tons of CO2, it's not exactly a small task. So really then the kind of question becomes, will all these new projects be successful? And from the work that our team has done on the topic, important to have, A, exposure to low-cost CO2 point sources, B, access to supportive policy incentives, and then also third, proximity to adequate carbon sinks. And those are all key differentiators, which we'll speak to as we move through the following slide. So starting from the beginning of the value chain, the map on your screen here visualizes capture opportunities using data available from Enverus ESG Analytics. And we have about 10,000 emitting stationary sources, which are displayed here on the screen, and they've been colored by sector and sized by annual CO2 volumes. You've also got operating projects, and those are there in the little orange stars, and existing CO2 pipes, which might be a little bit harder to see, but those are kind of the white lines usually connecting those orange stars. When we aggregate all this data, we start to see emission, pretty major emission centers emerge along the Gulf Coast and the Midwest states, and then in Alberta and Canada. So here's what that looks like. So Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama, they account for, and those are in the dark pink there towards the bottom of your screen, they account for about a quarter of U.S. emissions. And then those top 7 Midwest states in blue account for another 22% of the U.S. point source emissions. In Canada, Alberta alone accounts for about 55% of point source emissions, which justifies all the project announcements that we've seen to date come out of the province. Combined, the US and Canada account for about 2.8 billion tons per year of CO2, again, from stationary or point sources, and that translates to roughly 8% of global CO2 volumes. So from this information source that we just revealed on the last slide, we're also able to look at the information by sector, and it exposes power plants as the largest source of CO2, about 60% of the combined volumes in 2020, and that's followed then by petroleum and natural gas systems, refineries, and chemical manufacturing facilities. Just given the capital intensity of the capture processes, the technology does typically tend to favor larger emitting facilities where economies of scale can more easily be attained. And as we can see here from this figure, so refineries and power plants, those have historically released the most CO2 at each site. We'll contrast that against petroleum and natural gas systems, which tended to be kind of smaller, more distributed across a larger number of locations. So we just talked about scale, and scale does play into capture economics for sure. But one of the primary cost drivers that we see is the concentration and purity of CO2 in the gas stream. So to arrive at the capture break-evens, and these are just for capture of CO2 that you see here on the screen, we analyze over 50 cost estimates from active projects from engineering studies, and then normalized for regional cost trends and for facility size. So everything here should be normalized to 1 million tons per annum. On one side of the spectrum, so just focusing on the top kind of left portion of your screen, we have subsectors like natural gas processing, whose where in that process CO2 is kind of inherently captured, and then other subsectors like ammonia, so just under that, where CO2 is produced as a byproduct, and those have capture costs in the order of about kind of $25 to $30 per ton of CO2. On the other side of the spectrum, so just shift all the way to the bottom, we have power plants, and although those contribute some of the largest volumes of CO2 emissions, the average capture cost still surpasses $65 per ton, and that's a reflection of more so the dilute and impure nature of the gas streams. This information is interesting, but just to provide a little bit of context to it, we'll look at the 45Q tax credit in the US, which sits at today at $50 per ton. But to note that that credit is intended to be spread across the capture, transportation, and storage operations for CO2. At this particular rate, the credit only really covers the cost of capture for natural gas processing, ammonia, and petrochemical production, but that doesn't consider the cost of transportation and storage. If we layer those in, and we've heard more so kind of anecdotally, and it really can be very dependent on the project, but in the order of $5 to $20 per ton. We want to be conservative, so we add in $20 dollars per ton. Then those all-in costs hover around $50 per ton on average. Making really even those most economic projects, so the ones in that top left corner, making them challenging today, even for, again, those most competitive subsectors. So in order to incentivize broader adoption of the technology across multiple sectors, we really do need to see upgrades to 45Q. Assuming the proposed value of $85 per ton, and that's currently in Congress, so assuming that's realized, all these subsectors move into the green territory just from a capture standpoint. Again, need to also consider transportation and storage as well, but all those move into the green territory with the exception of coal-fired power plants, which remain in red there at the bottom of your screen. Okay. So we talked about policy enhancements. Kind of another popular topic as it relates to CCUS is technological advances, and those offer means of lowering capture costs. One of the challenges, though, just with the process of capturing CO2 is the energy-intensive nature of it. What you're looking at here, those are those same capture cost estimates that we saw on the prior slide, but now they've been broken out into capital, electricity, there in dark green, natural gas, and maintenance and fixed costs. Summing up, so if we sum up the natural gas component, which is used to regenerate the amine solvent, the electricity, which is needed to compress that CO2 up to its dense or supercritical state, and then just any ongoing maintenance and fixed costs, we can see that the operating costs, so dark green, light green, and orange, those amount to roughly half of the cost capture on average. If we focus in on what might be slightly easier to influence, we determined or wanted to determine to what extent does the capital need to fall in order to get us below that $50 per ton benchmark. While natural gas processing, fertilizer, ammonia production, petrochemicals is already sit below that point. We flip to this next slide here, we can see on average that we're needing a reduction of about 43% in our CapEx in order to hit that $50 per ton mark. Another popular approach folks here on the line might have heard discussion around in order to achieve cost efficiencies, and this is kind of a bit more so moving along the value chain, is through the use of shared infrastructure and storage facilities, or kind of these hub or kind of cluster models. In this figure here, we're looking at those emission points from an earlier slide near the beginning, but this time they've been colored by capture break-even, which is determined using our economic model that we just spoke about. In the model here, in the particular slide here, any of the points in green, those have the lowest capture break-even, so anywhere in the order between $30 and $50 per ton. And then gray is the other end of the extreme, so greater than $110 per ton. In order to identify, where might these potential hub locations be, we applied a spatial clustering algorithm to facilities that emitted over 100,000 tons of CO2 per year and were within 30 miles of another site. And then we colored each of these hubs by their calculated average capture break-even, which is what you should see here. Then just kind of focusing on the bottom of your screen, you'll notice that 6 of the top 15 low break-even hubs, those all fall along the Gulf Coast, which makes sense based on recent projects announcements that we've heard from parties like Denbury or Talos, or there's been a whole kind of handful of different companies in Houston, which announced that mega Houston hub, which includes companies like Exxon and Chevron too. So if we roll up all the emissions from those clusters that we saw on the previous slide, we get to the point, or get to the slide that you see here, which is the capture cost curve that's illustrated on your screen. Lots of information, but there's a few interesting points worth highlighting. The first is that roughly 250 million tons per annum, or about 15% of those hub emissions, break even below $50 per ton. Again, just to recognize this is just the capture break-even. If we layer in that $5 to $20 assumption for, transportation and storage, we want to be conservative. We add in $20. Those all-in costs surpass that $50 baseline, which makes it tough to justify large-scale investment in the technology today, and even for those most cost-competitive opportunities. Second is between $50 and $85 per ton. We see an additional 1.1 billion tons of capture break-even opportunities. And for context, in Canada and the US, we're emitting 2.8 billion tons per annum from stationary sources. So that 1.1 billion tons per annum, about 70% of that is coming from power generation. You can see that based on a lot of this. The figure is colored orange. That said, again, if we layer in the $20 per ton assumption for transportation and storage, that subset of economic opportunities is, cut, about in half, call it, give or take. So the takeaway here really should be that an upgrade to policy would move a number of these opportunities into economic territory, although the cost of capture, transportation, and storage really still would remain prohibitive for a good chunk of the emissions. Okay, so moving along our value chain, kind of to our last piece here, I'm just going to speak to storage, kind of some of the considerations that definitely need to be made on the tail end of the value chain. The slide that you're looking at here, it highlights just a subset of the saline aquifer pilots and operational sites from around the world that have achieved varying levels of success in terms of storage capability. While, we do foresee there being global potential for sequestration, what we've recognized or realized from the work that we've done is that there really isn't a one-size-kind-of-fits-all approach when it comes to determining what the optimal reservoir characteristics, injection rates, and overall storage capacity are. And I think that becomes clear as we look into some of the examples that you see here on your screen of successful and failed pilots. For example, if we move to the right and we look to Japan, the Tomakomai site, it was deemed unviable for injection due to low permeability, and that led to injection pressures nearing fracture pressures. And then the Nsala project, which is in Algeria, that one failed due to a loss of containment, the CO2 either escaping through an induced or an existing fracture. In contrast, the Sleipner project, so up there up top in Norway, that one has been operating successfully for 25 years with parameters like high permeability and high porosity, which you should be able to see here on the kind of the right-hand side of the polygon. Those contribute or continue to contribute to that site's ability to sequester about 1 million tons per year of CO2. From the work that our geo team has done, we recognize that there definitely are certain criteria that are really required for storage sites to be successful. And that's that CO2 is transported short distances to storage sites where it is sequestered in very thick, highly porous, impermeable sandstone reservoirs at depths greater than 2,700 feet with a sufficient cap rock. And that's, recognize it's a mouthful, that's a lot of information there. But the point really that we're trying to get across is that rigorous delineation is required to understand what realistic storage and injectivity potential does look like. So to kind of illustrate that, we wanted to walk through an example here along the Gulf Coast. We talked about the Gulf Coast. There's a lot of potential there from kind of a low-cost emitter standpoint. And we wanted to use this example in order to apply and kind of use our knowledge of what those key reservoir parameters look like. We started out using Enverus transform to map out the Frio formation. So we're looking first at the upper Frio sands, and then identify those sand intervals with high porosity, permeability, and water saturation. And the result is that blue contour that you see on the left side of your screen, and it's colored by storage potential. So in red, that's kind of best, and then in green, that's the lowest storage potential. Based on our estimates, we believe the sands can support 1.2 gigatons of CO2 storage overall. Again, with those hotspots mapped in San Patricio and Refugio counties there in that red color. We then extend this analysis kind of beyond just the upper Frio. Now we're going to look at the larger Frio area. We arrive at the boundary that you see here on your screen, which is defined by our optimal depth range. So anything to the northwest, that's too shallow, and then anything to the southeast, that's too deep. And as we can clearly see here, the best storage potential, it exists in more so isolated packages. And combined in all the Frio sands, we estimate a total storage capacity of about 117 gigatons of CO2. Like I've said before, one of the primary reasons we think the Frio is an ideal candidate for storage is based on its proximity to those low-cost emitters, and therefore that also minimizes the cost of transportation. Just among the emitters that fall within the clusters or hubs that we previously talked about a couple of slides back, we model about 250 million tons per annum of CO2 within a 100-mile radius of the Frio, and that works out to 460 years of CO2 injection. That's quite a lot. It's actually a pretty big number. But what we haven't accounted for here is potential connectivity. So if operators start injecting into multiple sand packages, and then how the pressure might respond as a result. The moral of the story, really what we're trying to get across here is that we do see a high degree of storage potential, in this case in the Frio, although to gain further confidence in our estimates, there is still work to do. That said, through pairing emissions with subsurface storage assessment, operating pipelines, where those operating projects, that gives us a pretty strong sense of the opportunity landscape and a really good starting point for understanding where project developers and investors should be focusing their efforts. Moving into part 2 now, we'll be a little bit more forward-looking, discussing trends that have emerged among planned projects. Just a couple, I guess, something to note too here is that the next few slides will incorporate operational and proposed projects in North America that have been disclosed as of the end of 2021. Also, only those projects with disclosed capacity or throughput in the absence of capacity. Okay. So we talked about it a few slides back at the beginning of this presentation, but now can we actually break down all those announced projects that we've seen out through 2025 and beyond? What we're looking at here is everything in pink. Those are existing or operating capture capacity projects, and then anything in green, that's what's been announced. What you see in orange there, that represents total capture capacity as a percentage of annual emissions. So you can see in regions like Alberta, so second from the left, that number is actually very high. So we're looking at about 65% of those emissions, which are covered by announced or operating capture capacity. You'll see Texas and Alberta, those two definitely lead the pack with over 90 million tons per year of CO2 capture capacity announced. And that again was just as of the end of 2021. There's been a number of projects announced since then. In Texas, a large part of what's driving that is hub development, and we spoke about the Houston Hub a little while earlier, whereas in Alberta, the development scheme is a little bit different. The government awards pore space access as opposed to in the US, where that's owned by the surface right owner. So there is a bit of a race in order to gain access to that, which is why we've seen such a large string of announcements or proposed projects in order to gain access as the government makes those allocations. In this particular slide here, we're trying to identify where opportunities might lie in the space. And we've assessed those opportunities on a couple of different dimensions. The first one is looking at that x-axis. This is the metric we just previously discussed. Total capture capacity as a percentage of annual emissions. So almost thinking of that as an adoption rate. Alberta, they're far on the right, we can see is at a kind of 65%. So that's a fairly high adoption rate relative to the amount of point source emissions. Versus you move far to the left, and you can see there's a number of states who have announced, very small number of projects based on capacity or no projects at all. The other dimension on the y-axis is emission-weighted capture break-evens. So the lower the capture break-even, the more competitive or compelling that opportunity. They're really focusing here on kind of moving towards the bottom left of the screen, and Louisiana stands out very much so on these two bases, but then also based on its proximity to low costs, or to strong storage potential in the Frio formation that we previously discussed. Beyond geography, we can also analyze this information from a sector standpoint. So anything on the left side of the screen, so in that pink color, that is operational capacity. And then anything on the right in the blue color, that's proposed. And the darker colors mean that they're larger capacity projects. What's kind of interesting to note if we're looking at oncoming projects is the amount of capacity assigned to multiple, so meaning projects that pull from or have CO2 come in from multiple different subsectors. And that's followed then by petroleum and natural gas systems and then by power plants. The DOE has funded quite a number of projects, or is intending to fund a number of projects at power plants, which is why we're kind of seeing some more outpaced adoption despite more uneconomic capture costs and competition from renewable technologies. And we talked about the capture cost piece there at the beginning. What I also think is interesting looking at that multiple segment and just kind of thinking about hub style development is we've definitely seen the emergence of this build it and they will come mentality. So operators or project developers for transportation and storage announcing these large, hub style projects where they intend to pull CO2 from multiple different sectors and sources, but without commitments from emitters at the front end. We believe this is a reflection of this mentality, and that carbon management will be similar service to water handling, where it will be a necessary cost for emitters, and more so a continuous revenue stream for transportation and storage providers. We're not there yet, but I think that's the assumption that's being inferred based on the development announcements of these hub projects. This side we can look, that's the same information, just looking into a little bit more granularity as we're looking at the subsector level as opposed to the sector level. So again, these are the projects announced as of the end of 2021. We can see that big chunk in pink is attributed to projects pulling in from multiple different facilities, which span different sectors and subsectors. We talked about onshore production, power generation on the last slide. We've seen an emergence of projects announced at LNG facilities, I believe 5 last year along the Gulf Coast, especially with demands from European customers or customers overseas for that lower carbon product. Ethanol production as well is pretty interesting, and we've seen a couple projects emerge in the Midwest where ethanol is among the cheapest to capture sources. But that said, they tend to be, these facilities are quite distributed, so they require large pipeline networks. Most of the ones that we've seen, or large-scale projects we've seen, are connecting facilities across 5 different states. So the transportation cost is also quite high. Historically, and I think it's well illustrated in these particular figures here, is that CCUS, the space, was dominated by CO2 EOR projects, and that's anything you can see in blue or any form of shade of blue. But really, the uptick in activity in proposed projects capacity adds has been driven by permanent sequestration almost entirely, and those are any of the pink wedges that you see there on your screen. I think many of us still do think there's merits to blue oil production, at least in the U.S., both from an economic standpoint and just relative emissions standpoint. But just the nature of emission reduction commitments and public opinion or optics to a degree has kind of fostered that preference for permanent sequestration. In areas like Canada, we mentioned the ITC, the investment tax credit, at the beginning of the session. But CO2 EOR has really fallen out of favor, and it's not incorporated in Canada's ITC, unlike in the US where CO2 EOR is still covered under 45Q. The last piece here and last trend I want to touch on before we end off is just around understanding who's involved and who's participating in the space based on projects that we've seen announced to date. What we can see here is that among announced capture capacity, that about 80% of that does have some form of involvement from an upstream or midstream company. And this, just to note, just based on the shift towards permanent sequestration, this is just focused on that permanent sequestration piece. We're not talking about any CO2 EOR projects here. Just also kind of keeping in mind, as we discussed before, there are hub projects here as well, and those tend to kind of skew the capacity numbers somewhat as well. But what we're really seeing, and we'll kind of show on the next slide here, is who makes up this pink wedge. Is there's a lot of kind of supermajors and large caps who can afford to be first movers in the space. They can afford to absorb more of the risk involved with these projects, because we do still see a high degree of policy, regulatory, and especially technical risk. And we spoke about that technical risk a couple minutes back when we were looking at the subsurface and different examples of success and failure. There have been, some emergence of some companies who are positioning themselves as pure play CCUS players or pretty close to that, so companies like Denbury or CRC. And then a few other smaller companies who, in Canada especially, who've partnered with a company called Mtpa, which is an Advantage subsidiary, to capture CO2 at gas plants. Just for a bit more granularity here around who's who is participating, we're looking at the various, project developers based on and coloring them by the sector from which they're capturing CO2. Exxon right there at the top, that's largely driven by, again, that Houston hub, and there are a number of other partners there involved. It's not just Exxon. Another interesting one there is in green at the 40 mark. You can see the Oil Sands Pathway Alliance, and that's a proposed project of up to 40 million tons per annum in 2 phases. And should that be successful and hit that capacity mark, that is the potential to reduce regional emissions, so along that kind of Fort Mac kind of corridor by 60%, which would make oil sands carbon intensity more so competitive with what we see in the lower 48 from unconventional production. And that was kind of the bigger guys, the bigger projects. This is more so smaller projects, which most of them most operators tend to be looking at capacity adds in total of, anywhere less than 5 million tons per annum. Oil and gas companies, again, we talked about them being pretty involved, and we've seen them partnering quite a bit with power plants and natural gas and LNG processing. So to wrap us up here today, I just wanted to leave everyone with a couple of key takeaways. The first being that, as we know, the large-scale deployment of CCUS is still very much so in its infancy, and there's a number of factors that have the potential to either act in favor or against broad adoption of the technology. As it stands today, the current policy, it really makes it tough and challenging to justify investment, as we spoke about earlier. A hike in 45Q from $50 to $85 per ton, that would catalyze a flurry of new projects, especially among the cheapest to abate sectors, but we'll wait for some more guidance on that one. Second, and I'd say kind of definitely a more underappreciated kind of piece of the puzzle, is that the rock definitely matters. And to stress that again, that not all storage sites are created equal. This is probably, from reading Peers' work, it's probably one of the most overlooked portions of the value chain, but really it is make or break for the future of the technology. If it doesn't work, then it's hard to justify doing all the work upstream of that. Like I said before, we believe that rigorous delineation is required to identify realistic storage and injectivity potential, and this continues to be a focus for our team in 2022. And then finally, as we spent the last few minutes there discussing, we are expecting a wave of CCUS capacity starting in the middle of the decade. Just based on recent disclosure, this growth will be driven by permanent sequestration projects and a focus on hub-style development in order to capture those economies of scale. With that, just want to thank everyone for their time. Appreciate you listening and interacting.